Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about Wreck-It Ralph 2. Wreck-It Ralph Breaks the Internet, not Wreck-It Ralph Wrecks the Internet. There's a few ways that I could introduce my description of this movie. One would be, this is what happens when you have normies try to make a movie about the internet. Another one would be, this is what happens when you take a 20-minute long Futurama episode from 20 years ago and try to stretch it into a 90-minute movie. And hopefully you know the Futurama episode I'm thinking about. There's probably more. This is what happens when you take the show Reboot and you make it the internet instead of a computer. That's what Wreck-It Ralph 2 is. Wreck-It Ralph, the original Wreck-It Ralph was a movie that charmed a lot of people with its nostalgic references, its likable characters, and it had a nice little plot. This movie contains almost nothing from the original Wreck-It Ralph movie that made it endearing, that made it enjoyable, or that made it funny. This is a movie that misses on almost every account right from the get-go, right from the setup with its story, and indeed all the way through all of its execution. There's lots of different ways to write a comedic movie, but there's two big ones. One is what I call decorating the Christmas tree. You make a Christmas tree and you hang the decorations on it, meaning you write a story, you tell what jokes you can along the way. The other one is you just tell jokes and you don't worry about the story. So, a tree with jokes on it would be like Ghostbusters. The other way, just writing jokes, would be like Monty Python, or maybe Super Troopers or something like that, where you put a story in between the gags. In this case, they really tried to do both. They tried to have a story and they tried to put jokes in there, kind of crammed in, that they decided they needed to have before they even really started constructing a story. And it just doesn't work out. It just doesn't come off very well. So let me go ahead and break down some of the categories, and I can explain a lot of the problems with this movie. So first of all, I like to talk about production. It's all the visual and sound stuff. So first one would be aesthetics, right? Now the first movie had an animation aesthetic that referenced these older 2-bit games and also referenced some of the newer 3D games, including maybe like a parody of Gears of War or something like that. And it worked really well. So this is a repetition of those aesthetics, except they're abstracted from the imaginary arcade and instead put into this internet world that they've created, which is basically just a rip off of that old Futurama episode that I talked about. So the aesthetics, I'm only going to give them a 6 out of 10 because they really don't reference anything that's nostalgic or endearing like it was with the first movie. They're just cartoon characters walking through some poor representations of the internet. Indeed, the visual representation of the internet is very inferior to what they did in Futurama, just with like computer cell shaded animations way back like 20 years ago. So the aesthetics are generally a failure, but they're not obtuse. They're not bad looking on the eyes. They just don't fit the theme of the movie or the story at all. Next, animation effects. I give those an 8 out of 10. They are good. Like, it's a competently animated film. There are action sequences which are very well constructed. But in general, it's missing a lot of the pizzazz that the first movie had. There's a lot of explosions, there's a lot of fast movements, but not a lot of things that are visually exciting outside of those moments. So overall, animation effects, 8 out of 10. Music, I gave a 4 out of 10. I wasn't really a fan of the original music because in some cases they referenced a lot of the 8-bit sounds of yore, but they ended up with sort of a general soundtrack in the first movie. And in this one, you're missing all of those things which made the original soundtrack okay, and instead it's replaced with like blasting pop music the entire time, and kind of standard track music. It was really obtuse and annoying, so I gave the music a 4 out of 10. That makes the total production score a 6 out of 10. That's like a D. That's not a great production score for a major studio, in my opinion. Something coming out of Disney ought to have a production score of 7 and up, considering how much money and effort they spend on their movies. Next, let's talk a little bit about story. Story is going to I usually talk about 3 different parts: setting, characters, plot. Sometimes I skip setting. I won't skip it for this one. The main reason is the setting has a lot to do with the failure of the story, so I have to address it. So the setting, I actually give it a 2 out of 10. The idea that you're going to take the sort of the bedrock of this original movie, the first movie, Wreck-It Ralph, which is this idea that what if all the computer characters from these video games and arcade machines were alive? So it's kind of like Reboot, if you remember the show Reboot. And you spend some time in that first movie constructing the rule set of the world. Okay, the sprites from the game, they can go in and hang out inside the power strip or inside the plugs, and they can go into other games. But if the game gets turned off, like, they'll die. So they have to leave before the game gets turned off. And of course, like glitches. So glitches can't leave. They come up with a rule set that, in essence, defines the world and encapsulates it, and it closes it so that it can't. So you have real risk involved with everything. Well, right away from the get-go, they actually discard some of the rule sets from the original game, where you have Vanellope and Ralph. Vanellope originally couldn't leave her machine because she was a glitch, that's kind of been resolved. They kind of threw that out the window. And then they're like, well, you can step out into this Wi-Fi thing, and then you can enter the internet. And once you leave this world where there's a defined rule set, you go to the internet where there's essentially no defined rule set. And the risks have to be conjured up on the go in a way that you never really feel like the characters are in any kind of great danger, because you don't know ahead of time what's going to end up proving to be their doom. So the setting ends up being a big failure, and that kind of goes in step with the aesthetics for how they wanted to represent the internet. It's just a bunch of little avatars walking around doing stuff. The idea that you can have these computer-generated characters or sprites able to enter the internet and act like people, there's a big disconnect. So they like go to eBay, they bid on stuff, they do all these different things that people can do, and it's never clear like how they're able to do it or why they're able to do it, or whether other computer game characters can do it, and to what extent they can do it. So it all seems kind of helter-skelter. It's all over the place as far as the setting is concerned. And again, they conjure up a couple things as they go in order to create danger. One is like a virus, and they just kind of like, well, the virus will do this, and then they're like, okay, well, we need more conflict because we still have to fill up 30 more minutes of movie, so we'll have the virus get out and destroy the internet somehow, right? So they come up with a long series of events that each one is preceded by a setup that will somehow create danger for the characters. It just doesn't end up working out very well. And that's where most of the movie takes place. It takes place in, quote, the internet. And of course, part of the story is them constantly referencing things about the internet. And the things that they reference about the internet, I mentioned, it was like, this is what happens when normies write a movie about the internet, is they're referencing the most basic dumb stuff that a reference kind of movie, like a pop culture reference kind of movie, should reference things that mean something to the fandom. And that's kind of what the first movie did. The first Wreck-It Ralph movie was referencing all these old video games. And so if you're a millennial or older, an Xer, and you grew up with these games, you watch this movie and you're like, oh yeah, and you like all the little references and jokes that have to do with the old games. In this case, the references and the jokes have to do with the internet itself, only nobody would reasonably find them funny. If they spend a lot of time on the internet, then those things would be like really, really kind of passé jokes. It'd be like joking about pancake skillets or something completely mundane. And in a lot of cases, the references are, the best one that they could come up with was like Ralph getting sad about seeing the comment section on his YouTube videos. Somehow he's able to make YouTube videos, except they call him BuzzTube, I think. But it's YouTube, right? So he gets upset that the comments are negative, and then they just kind of get past that. And it's like, you never look at the comment section. It's like, no, you look at the comment section if you actually do this. So it's kind of from the perspective of somebody who doesn't ever have to deal with like customers on the internet, or like an audience that they need to interact with and want to develop a relationship with. It's just like the evil audience that tells them they're lame and therefore they need to ignore the comment section. It was like one of these very tone deaf moments when they had that. It's like, yeah, I get a lot of mean comments from time to time, except their reaction to it, it's like from celebrities or people who work for big studios who never have to deal directly with their customers' displeasure or their customers' pleasure even, no real interaction with customers, and therefore the comment section is toxic. There's a couple things that they do with this too, because there's so much references. They do this really bizarre section where one of the characters, Vanellope, is hanging out with Disney princesses, right? And so they're trying to do a bunch of references about Disney princesses, but they all come off as like somebody who's never actually watched the Disney movies in question. And they end up throwing a bunch of feminist jokes in that don't make sense. It's like, do you need a big, strong man to save you? Then you could be a Disney princess, except like every single one of them sitting in the circle wasn't saved by a man. And the only one was Sleeping Beauty. And like none of the others were saved by a man. Like Snow White, the dwarves killed the witch. Like all the Disney princess movies, it's not about being rescued by a man in most cases. It's about the main, if the main character is a princess, it's usually about her kind of getting out of her own predicaments, on at least on some level, although there's usually a love interest in the form of a man. So it was also one of these tone-deaf moments where you're just cramming in these dumb feminist jokes that not only are they just like completely tone deaf, they don't even make sense with what you're referencing. And this happens constantly. They're constantly referencing dumb things from the internet, things which would only seem interesting or original if you were born in, or not born, but you know, if you had made this movie in like 2006 or 2007, back when people were like, oh, there's this thing called YouTube, you know. But for 2018, 2019, it's just awful. So 2 out of 10 on the setting. And that's one of the biggest problems with it. And of course, the setting creates the bedrock for the story, and a lot of the problems just kind of flow from there. So characters, I gave the characters a 3 out of 10. In the first movie, the characters were pathetic in a way that made you like them, right? Because there's some empathetic aspects. Everybody can identify on some level with being a social outcast. Nobody has like 100% social success, or if the people who do are very, very rare, right? So everyone can identify with, to a certain extent, with kind of being the outcast and not being invited to the party, or can imagine what that's like. And so you feel for Ralph and you feel for Vanellope, who's excluded because she's different. And those things make those characters likable and enjoyable and provide growth for them. In this case, what you have, instead of characters who've reached a point from, you know, growing from the first movie, you have them just acting badly. They end up pathetic in a bad way. So Ralph is not pathetic because he's a victim of bad circumstances in a world that doesn't view him as a valuable member in it. Ralph is now just pathetically bad. He's a bad person with a bad personality who acts selfishly, stupidly, and with bad morals and bad motivations throughout the movie. So he's that. And then, of course, Vanellope, rather than being a character that has growth, she's also a character that's, you know, she has to go find herself or something like that. And it just doesn't really come off as believable. Every time there's friction between the characters, it comes off as melodramatic, like forced drama that's added for the sake of trying to get past the plot point to create another plot point for them to work towards. And overall, the characters just were not very fun to watch. They weren't likable. And it's one of those things where the characters were likable in the first movie, and because of the way they look and act in the second movie, kind of makes them just less likable in general. So 3 out of 10 for the characters. And that's if the characters, and there's only 2 characters that receive any kind of character treatment. That's the main 2, Ralph and Vanellope. Their character development is backwards in most cases and really doesn't go anywhere. The rest of the characters don't really have much growth. So, you know, Fix-It Felix and his wife or whatever from the Gears of War game, they're just kind of pushed to the side for a couple of jokes about how hard it is to raise kids. Again, more of that like anti-child message that's being sent pretty often in movies these days. They don't really do anything. They're in like a couple scenes, and then otherwise that's it. And none of the other little auxiliary characters, they're all static. So there's no other interest there. There were a couple cases where the characters were slightly enjoyable or slightly likable. There's this this spam bot guy who is just, it kind of reminds you of a shady businessman. He's a little bit funny. He has a weird sidekick that doesn't speak but just looks weird, and a weird virus that they meet. And so those are 3 characters and 3 points, you know, that are somewhat likable and kind of enjoyable and fun. Next, plot. So characters 3 out of 10, setting 2 out of 10. Plot, I give it a 4 out of 10. So slightly better than the characters. But the problem is they create a main conflict, a main plot goal, which is Vanellope's machine breaks. Like the steering wheel on it breaks. And so they have to get a new steering wheel, but the company that made it's gone out of business and the new steering wheel is expensive. It costs several $100s on eBay. So they go onto the internet to get it, not quite realizing like how they get it. But so they end up creating a bid on eBay of like several thousand, like $35,000. Then they have to make $35,000. And so the writers came up with an obvious solution to that. So within the first act of the movie, not only did you have the big conflict set up, you had the immediate resolution of it like right in sight, which is they were going to steal this rare piece of loot in a video game and sell it for like $60,000 or something, which would have given them all the money they needed to buy Vanellope's steering wheel. And there's going to be some plot spoilers here, just be warned. They're about to escape with it, and then they can't, and then the characters who were trying to stop them become friends with them for no reason. And then from there, it was this moment where it's like, oh, we created the solution to our plot, but we can't have the movie end. So let's just have them not be successful and just abandon that whole track, right? It's like they could have gone back in the game and stolen this item. It was a car. It was like a car in a GTA MMO kind of thing, right? So they just abandon that, and they're like, how are we going to make money? And then Ralph's like, I'll be an internet star on BuzzTube, and I'll make $40,000 in the next few hours. Which ends up being like a really kind of a stupid thing, because again, it's written from a perspective of people who've never made content on the internet, so they don't really realize what goes into it or why people watch it or how any of that works. It just kind of comes off as a little bit tone deaf, and that's part of the setting. But they come up with this sort of thing. Then it turns out Vanellope doesn't want to go back to her machine because reasons. She wants to stay in this Grand Theft Auto MMO, which renders the entire plot moot. And then of course, like, they need a third act, so a virus escapes from this game and destroys the internet, and Ralph has to fix his personality in order for the virus to go away. It's called an insecurity virus. And there's nothing particularly likable about a character who has to fix his personality in order for other people to like him, versus a character who has to convince other people he's valuable, like in the first movie. One of those has a pathos that is familiar and creates empathy. The other one just creates dislike in general. And that's one of the things that I ended up really not liking about the way the plot works. So the ABC story, the A story is like, we got to get this steering wheel back. The B story is Vanellope kind of wants to not go back to her, so it renders the A story kind of moot. And then the C story is Wreck-It Ralph needs to figure out how to not make his best friend always spend time with him, which just neurosis doesn't end up being very funny in a kids movie. So total 3 out of 10 for the story. And so general effect is the last category. That's how I feel about it. I gave it about a 4 out of 10. There were moments where I almost chuckled. There were some good animation sequences. But most of the entire charm from the first movie was well gone. There was a few moments where they did okay references with the arcade, but mostly, I kind of laughed when they had the arcade owner like boot up his iMac, like one of the candy colored iMacs from the late 90s. I kind of can appreciate little pieces of reference humor like that, but those were really few and far between. So I gave it a 4 out of 10. That gives the total 4.3 out of 10. That's actually an F in my book, so this is a pretty bad movie. It all stems from creating a sequel with an idea that you want to expand what's there, but you don't know really what you're expanding into. And not realizing that what made your original movie charming wasn't the characters by themselves, and it wasn't electronics. It was particular nostalgic references and an ability to create a story that made you sympathize and like characters, and also played into this imaginative idea that, like, what if sprites were alive, that a lot of kids have maybe thought, like, I wonder what it would be like if my video game characters were like alive in there somehow. So all of that charming stuff is lost in this movie, and it just ends up being a really, really poorly executed sequel for what was a pretty endearing little movie from a couple years ago. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I do have a new little novella coming out. It's called Crown of Sight. Slight title change. I'll explain that in another video where I talk more about the book. But make sure you watch out for that. It'll be out on March 22nd on all platforms. Right now, it's available for pre-order on Amazon, and the physical copy will come a little bit before the 22nd, so you could get it in your hands if you want to buy a physical copy. It's pretty small. It's only about 23,000 words, so even shorter than Old Man in the Sea, but it's full of plot, and it's as tight a story as I could write in that amount of space. And I'm pretty excited to put it out. I want to see what people think about a very tightly written short story of that kind. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Leave me your thoughts about Wreck-It Ralph down below. Be interested to see if you liked it, why you liked it, and what about it actually appealed to you. And if you liked it less than me, let me know what really upset you about it. But to me, it was mostly kind of like a big cringe of a movie made by people who were out of touch with their subject matter, which was not the case with the first one. The first one, it felt like it was made by people who actually liked those older games. But in this one, it felt like an Xer or a boomer that was just out of touch with what the internet actually was. And of course, when you make it as a kid's movie, you have to avoid most of the real humor that would go along with the internet. Just my thoughts. So thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.